it'd still be a beautiful morning because we have the gift of life. We have the gift of breath, and we have the gift of freedom to gather together and worship. And of course, some things go wrong at times, and you know what? We're flexible, and it's wonderful that we have hymns, right? We have hymnals to just follow along with. It is truly wonderful when Satan tries to throw a wrench in our plans, and guess what? God wins. God wins. He's already won. Well, this morning, the message I have titled The Turning Point. Now, normally I would have it behind me, and I had it all prepped. Don't think I did this just to get out of work. That is not the case. It's all done. It just malfunctioned. But this morning, the message is the turning point. And we're in John chapter 11 today, verses 38 to 57. We're wrapping up this, honestly, 3-week session on John 11. We've been in John 11 for quite a while. We're finishing it today. And this moment in John 11 is a massive turning point throughout the book of John. If you really think about it, the book of John is 21 chapters. So, this is about the halfway point. John 11, the end of John 11 is a little over the halfway point. But more than that, John 11 is a remarkable turning point in Jesus' ministry. And the entirety of his ministry turns today. And we'll see that. But I want to start off because we all have these moments. These moments in our life where everything changes. My life changed when my dad passed away. When I was living the motions, just going through life, being the good Christian kid I was, and then my life changed when my dad passed away. It was a turning point where I made my faith my own and had to walk through that. Maybe you've got a turning point like that in your own life. Maybe your turning point was a little different because maybe your life changed when you got that dream job. Or you got that first paycheck from the sale barn. Maybe that was your life-changing moment. Maybe your life-changing moment was when a mentor finally told you about Christ. There's so many turning points in our life where everything changes, where we grow up, where we learn something new, and it shifts our focus, our life, to follow it. The same thing is true in Jesus' life. There were turning points that shifted and moved his ministry. And of course, Jesus knew it was coming. He did, but it still was a turning point. And today is one of those. They're important, though. These turning points are. Turning points are crucial in our life. And there's a specific turning point in our life that is most crucial of all. And we'll talk about that as we walk through John 11. But before we get going, let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this morning. Lord, with all the malfunctions and all the problems, twists, turns, Lord, thank you that you are the foundation we stand upon. Now, when everything else around us shakes, you are still firm. Thank you, Father. Now this morning, as we dive into your word, Lord, let it hit us. Let it impact us so that when we walk out, we go and are made new. We love you, Lord, and we thank you. In your name I pray. Amen. Like I said, we're going to be in John chapter 11, finishing it up today. We're going to take a break next week when Josh is here. I'm extremely excited. If you have time, please come check it out. Come join us as he presents his ministry. If you can wake up early enough, he's going to do a Q&A for Sunday school. So if you can wake up on time, to get here for Sunday school, do. Because he's going to have our Sunday school hour and my sermon time next week to talk to us. It'll be truly exciting. I'm super pumped. And we'll have potluck after that. But today, John 11, that's our focus. And it actually times wonderfully that Josh would come next week and kind of give us a break from John, a breath. Because this is the turning point of the book of John. From where we started to now, we've built Jesus' ministry. We've looked at all these signs and wonders that Jesus was doing in public to show people who He was. And now we have a turning point. Even our first 2 weeks of John, we're building that, right? We talked about how God works differently than us. But then last week we talked about He still feels with us. He knows what we're going through. He feels us. Well, this week is a massive turning point. And we're going to go ahead and just walk through the passage, not going to read it in its entirety. We're just going to take step by step and just let's walk through it. The first part we need to walk through is a miracle itself. The first step, first piece of our turning point this morning is the miracle itself that we've talked about. We've been kind of hinting at the last 2 weeks. And it's in verses 38 to 44. Because Jesus is with these people. If you remember the context we've laid the last 2 weeks, Jesus is with Martha and Mary as Lazarus dies. After he dies, actually. Jesus joins Martha and Mary, Lazarus' sisters, along with a number, we don't know, of mourners. Friends of the family, professional mourners, whatever it may be, Jesus comes and joins them. Grieves with them. If you remember, Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible. Some of the most powerful meaning behind it. That Jesus feels with us as He's with these people, grieving with them. And we talked about how Jesus, in His deepest heart, was deeply moved by the moments around Him, by the things happening around Him. Well, as we pick up in verse 38, as they arrive at the tomb, Jesus is still in this state of movement. In His innermost being, Jesus is still deeply distraught with these people. He's grieving. He's feeling with them. And He continues as He arrives at the tomb. And it describes the tomb for us. It says it's a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Now, this was a very typical tomb. I had a picture of it. But if you've seen almost any Easter promotion, it has a picture of these kind of tombs with just a cave in a hill with a massive stone rolled across the front or rolled to the side. That's one kind of tomb. There's actually a second kind of tomb that very well could be the tomb we're talking about here. And it's a vertical tomb. The pictures we often see at Easter are like a horizontal tomb where the entrance is, just ground level, where we're standing. Where these vertical tombs are like in the top of the hill. And it's down below. The Greek, there's debate about this. I'm not going to get into it very much. The Greek shows some evidence for that. Because when, we'll see in a little bit, the verbing used shows a little bit of raising up like a vertical tomb would take. But then also there's evidence for it being a horizontal tomb. These vertical tombs were a private burial for families. It was a little different. We don't know exactly what it is. We don't need to know. We know that it's a tomb with a stone rolled across its entrance. Whatever that may be, that's what we need to know. So as they arrive at this tomb, this cave in a hill, Jesus is still deeply moved. Then in verse 39, Jesus looks at the people and says, roll the stone aside. Roll the stone out of the way. So, question. If Jesus is God, He could have done it Himself. He could have just snapped His fingers, rolled the stone out of the way, and Lazarus could have walked out. Why did Jesus say, roll it away? Possibly because Jesus wanted to see their faith. If you remember earlier, a couple weeks ago, when Jesus was talking with Martha, He asked her, do you believe? Do you believe all these things I've said about myself? And we talked about it, she gives one of the most beautiful confessions in Scripture in verse 27. Yes, I believe you're the Messiah, the Son of God, the one sent from God. Now Jesus puts it to the test. If you really believe, move that stone out of the way so I can do it. That's a possibility. That's conjecture. That's maybe what the evidence, why that conversation is hinting at. But we don't know that for sure. All we know is Jesus said, roll the stone aside. Just roll it out of the way. And what does Martha say? She says, Lord, he has been dead 4 days. The smell will be terrible. If you remember, we talked about that 4-day mark is the mark of decomposition starting. So the smell would be terrible. They didn't embalm bodies in this day. They didn't have the technology, all of that to embalm a body. What they did was wrap it in cloth with spices to try and combat the smell of decomposition. So, of course, 4 days, body starts wasting away. It's going to smell pretty bad. I'll be honest, I would not have wanted to been there in that case. I'm not a huge fan of smells. If it's bad, I'll be running out the door. But imagine just the stench that would have been there in this moment. Why, though? Why did Martha doubt? Remember, she, in verse 27, shouts, I believe you. I believe who you are. Now, verse 27, she says, I don't know. I don't know if that's such a good idea. Why? Because of, if I can put it my way, because of a very simple phrase. Easier said than done. It's a lot easier for us to make a creed of faith. Creed is just a fancy word for, yes, I believe it. It's a lot easier for us to say we believe than when life comes rolling down the tracks, barreling at us. Faith becomes a lot harder to put into practice, does it not? That, we can sit here and say, yeah, I know God's got it no matter what comes. And then finances start getting in question. And then relationships start breaking apart. Family members die. Tragedy happens. And our faith goes out the window. Remember Peter? Remember Thomas? 2 more examples of faith in creed where Peter says, I will go to the cross with you. And Thomas says, let's go die with Jesus. And then when life comes and they have to put their faith into practice, what happens? Peter denies Jesus and Thomas doubts. And Martha argues with the stone. It's life. Life is difficult. Our faith is tested through fire. Think through the purification process for precious metals is to be put into fire. Yet, the Bible tells us our faith is more precious. Our wisdom is more precious than silver or gold. So yeah, it's going to take some refining through fire. It's called life. Going through life, being able to say, yes, I believe, okay, then we got to put it into practice. Then we have to actually live it out. It gets hard. That's why Martha doubts. That's why Martha argues back. Because life just hit her. Her brother's actually in there. He's been dead for 4 days. There's no possible way he can be coming back from the dead. No possible way. Except for an act of God, right? We talked about that. And that's exactly what is about to happen. This act of God that's coming. Because then Jesus reminds Martha and everybody there that belief pays off. Look at what he says in verse 40. Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? Didn't I tell you that you can see the power of God if you believe? Jesus reminds Martha, in light of her doubt, in light of life struggling with faith, that it pays off. That the glory of God is worth more. That seeing the beauty of God's power is worth more than questions of life. So Jesus says that, reminds the people. And they say, okay, he's right. He's right. So they rolled the stone away in verse 41. Then Jesus, as they open the tomb, looks up to heaven. It's a precursor to prayer. How many times when you and I pray, do we just immediately look up to heaven? Do we just look up? It's a habit of mine. It's a precursor to prayer. Precursor for Jesus to have this conversation with God the Father. And as he looks up, he thanks God for hearing his prayer. In verse 41, end of 41. Father, thank you for hearing me. Pause. When, in our little time here, did Jesus actually pray for Lazarus to be raised from the dead? He didn't. That is significant. The fact that John doesn't include the prayer that Jesus has shows us that Jesus was in constant prayer. That Jesus lived prayer. Constantly, in his everyday walk, was in prayer with his Father. That's why Jesus can stand there now, as he stands at the tomb, and just say, God, thank you for hearing me. Because he's lived out prayer every step of the way. And of course, God heard him every step of the way. God heard all of Jesus' prayers. Every single one of them. Even the silent ones no one else knew about. Now the truth remains the same for you and I. God hears our prayers, every single one of them. The silent ones that no one else knows. The loud ones, even when we're alone in our house. God hears them. So we can say the same thing. God, thank you for hearing me. And Jesus continues. He says in verse 42, you always hear me. but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they may believe you sent me. That's more evidence that God hears those silent prayers. The prayers when we don't have the words, God hears them. And Jesus says, okay, I didn't, you always hear me, God, but I said it out loud for the benefit of these people with me, so they could believe God was the one who sent him. So they could believe the things Martha cried out in verse 27. That's why Jesus said, Father, thank you for hearing me. So that everyone else then could stand there and say, I believe you are the Messiah. I believe you are the Son of God. I believe you're the one sent from God. That's why Jesus prayed out loud in this moment. And as he finishes this prayer, Jesus says, Lazarus, come out. He shouts it. I apologize, I did not give that justice. Jesus shouts, Lazarus, come out. The Greek for shout in the NLT, the Greek word used there is a great voice, a loud voice. It's a foreshadow to the moment at the end of time when God shouts, come alive. And those trumpets ring, and all that glorious moment where we are raised from the dead for life with Him. This is a foreshadow, a picture Jesus gives of what is to come. Because what happens when Jesus says, Lazarus, come out? He comes out. He walks out of the grave. Now that Greek lesson and all of that, when Jesus says, Lazarus, come out, and in this moment, the verbing used comes from the Greek word airo. If I remember correctly, I'd have to double check. There's like 20 different forms to it. Don't ask me to repeat all of them. I'm still learning. But that word airo is to raise up. So there's kind of our hint. It might be a vertical grave if he's saying rise. But we don't know. There's hints at it, but we don't know. But Lazarus comes out, giving this beautiful foreshadow to the end of time when God calls us out of the grave. That should bring us hope. This moment, this miracle brings hope to our life. And it's this peak moment in Jesus' ministry, raising a man from the dead. Yeah, he's healed the blind, he's healed the leper, he's done all these things, but now he's raising dead people back to life. There's a peak here. The mountaintop of Jesus' ministry, just raising a man from the dead. And as Lazarus comes out of the grave, look at what Jesus says. Unwrap him and let him go. Of course, pretty standard if a person's covered in grave cloth, wrapped head to toe. It's going to be pretty hard for him to walk around and do anything wrapped up. So he's got to get him off, let him free, let him do his thing. But there's also a little bit of symbolism to this. Because as Jesus says, unwrap him and let him go, it shows us what we have to do. We have to unwrap ourselves of our sin, our habits, and let ourselves be free. Now, of course, I am not saying we will never sin. That is not what I'm saying. But here's the point. When we are raised from death to life in Jesus Christ, we have to put off our old self. That old self dead to sin. It starts with just a quick release that is behind us. But it's an active thing as well. We have to daily put off our old self. We have to daily sacrifice our old self, our old desires, and live in freedom. That's this unwrap and let Him go. That's unwrapping ourselves and living in freedom. Putting our old self to death. Sacrificing the old desires for the new creation. Again, easier said than done. But it's truth. Jesus performs this miracle in front of a bunch of people. At least 3. Mary, Martha, and a mourner. But there's probably closer to 50. He does this miracle, this pinnacle, this peak of His ministry on earth. All those years Jesus spent, 3 years in ministry, building up to this. Building up to this moment where He reveals the true power He has. The glory He has. But here's the thing. This peak of ministry did not just bring out good. It brought out some problems. The second piece of our process, our turning point, if you will, is the problem. And we see it in verses 45 to 48. Because, this moment had waves of effect. It impacted a lot of people. The first part, right in 45, it says, many of the people who were there, who were with Mary, believed in Jesus when they saw this happen. Great. That's a wonderful thing. Absolutely wonderful. People believed who Jesus was at this moment. They saw the miracle for all its trueness, that Jesus was the Messiah, and believed. This faith that they have here might be based on sight, so it might be not as strong, but it's still faith. Faith without sight is strong. That's just the best way I can put it. Not having proof. If you believe something without having proof, if I can talk right, if you believe something without proof of it, that takes some deep belief. Faith based on proof is still proof, though. Oh boy. I'm going to just take a nap real quick. Faith based on proof is still faith. There we go. It might not be as deep, as strong, but it is still faith. Now, it's for lack of a better term, it's a springboard. It's that foundation of, okay, you've got the faith. Now let's springboard it to faith without sight. It's a process, but it's faith. Just like in our life. If we have faith because we've seen the miracles God's done in our life, then you know what? It's faith. It is. We believe. If you've believed in Christ without any of that proof, that's some faith. Now, the process and the goal is for everyone to get to this belief without sight. But here in this moment, we see this beautiful effect that Jesus raising Lazarus has. But there's a flip side. Because it says many believed, but not all. Others did the opposite. What did they do? Verse 46, but some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Some snitched. Some went straight to the religious leaders and said, hey, he just did another one. Now, in modern terms, snitches get stitches. But in this moment, these snitches fueled our turning point. Because now the problem begins to boil up. Jesus posed a threat. And we'll see it here in a second. Because the Pharisees heard what Jesus had done and called a meeting. They had a problem. There was a threat. It says in verse 47, then the leading priests and Pharisees called the high council together. The leading priests is the chief priest, the captain of the temple, and the priestly family. That's who calls this meeting of the Sanhedrin, the high council. The Sanhedrin was composed of 71 members. 35 were Pharisees, 35 were Sadducees, and then you had the chief priest. That makes up your 71. The Sanhedrin was this ruling council that sat under the thumb of the Roman government and ruled the Jewish people. Composed of religious leaders made for government under the Roman thumb. That's the Sanhedrin. And they gather together within themselves and ask themselves a question. What are we going to do? Now, this is not a good way to translate this question. The Greek puts it better, or a couple other translations format the Greek better when they say, what are we now doing? They're asking themselves, Jesus is doing all of this, what are we doing about it? Well, the answer was they're trying to arrest him, but they couldn't get their hands on him. So, in all reality, nothing. They sit there and say, okay, we can't deny he's doing these miracles. It's happening. And here's our problem. If we let him keep doing it, everyone's going to believe him. Which was evidenced throughout Jesus' ministry. Every miracle Jesus did, more and more believed him. So if he keeps going, everyone's going to believe him. Now that causes a problem for the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. Because if everybody believes Jesus, no one will believe us. No one will follow us. They'll follow Jesus. And then the Romans are going to get mad and come and kill us. That's the threat Jesus poses. He poses a threat to the religious leaders' way of life. They're the hot shots, remember? They're I should have left the ladder out, Rick. They're the ones claiming to be high and mighty. They're the ones thinking of themselves better than everybody else. Now, if Jesus comes and challenges that, they lose their position. They lose all their weight. That's the threat. And then the Romans will come, because now the Sanhedrin doesn't have any weight, doesn't have any power, so the Romans don't have any power, and wipe them all out. Then we come to the solution to this problem. Verses 49 to 53. And the chief priest Caiaphas gives his solution. Now, Caiaphas was the current high priest. I want to make this, I don't know what, the word just slipped my mind. I want to make this point, I guess, that Caiaphas was the current high priest. The Romans would put the high priest in control, and if the high priest didn't follow Roman rule and follow exactly what Rome wanted him to do, he was out, and a new guy will be put in. So that's why in the Bible it says Caiaphas, the current high priest. That's how my Bible words it. Who was high priest at that time. It's because he could be kicked out any day. If he does one thing wrong, he's gone. So he makes his solution. He brings this idea up. First off, he starts by mocking everybody around him. Now, I don't know how well it works if you're going to try and bring a solution to a problem and you start by saying everybody else is ridiculous and knows nothing. I mean, in my mind, that doesn't work very well. Because Caiaphas looks at him and says, you don't know what you're talking about. You have no clue what you're doing. You don't know anything, he says. And then he gives a cynical solution to their problem. He says, killing Jesus would be better than killing us all. His answer is if we kill Jesus, it's a better outcome than losing our position to the Romans. So let's just kill Jesus. Well, the irony here is, he just summed up the gospel. Caiaphas, in this cynical solution to his problem, summed up the gospel. Kill him so I don't have to die. Wait a second. Sound familiar? Because didn't Jesus die so we can live? As he sits there, making this statement, look at verse 51. He did not say this on his own. As high priest at that time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would die for the entire nation. And not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all the children of God scattered around the world. So as Caiaphas sits here and says, let's kill Jesus so we don't have to die, he just sums up the entire gospel. Let Jesus die on behalf of me. And of course, we know Jesus did exactly that. God led him, guided him to prophesy and say Jesus will die for our nation and for all of God's children scattered throughout the world, which includes you and me if we are believers. It's kind of funny. Kind of sad, but kind of funny. Dude's trying to be cynical and bring up this solution, but in all reality, he sums up the truth that we celebrate, that Jesus did just that. And so as Caiaphas says this, they begin, the Sanhedrin, these religious leaders begin plotting how to kill Jesus. Okay, let's plot our turning point for a moment. As we come into John 11, Jesus is building his ministry publicly, proclaiming who he is. Then, if you picture a U-turn arrow, as we get to that start of the turn, we're at the miracle, that pinnacle of Jesus' ministry. We start to turn with our problem and our solution. Then we get to the aftermath, that other side of the arrow. Our aftermath is found in verses 54 to 57. Because in verse 54, it says, as a result, As a result to the religious leaders trying to kill Jesus now, he goes into, I put quotes around this because it's not the right word, he goes into hiding. Jesus pauses and stops his public ministry. Because of course, if he's out in public, they'll arrest him. So Jesus leaves Jerusalem with his 12 disciples and goes to Ephraim, just 13 miles northeast of Jerusalem. Goes not that far away, but, just away enough so they're not looking for him. And he stays there with his 12 disciples, spending time with them. And it quickly becomes time for the Passover festival. Verse 55, it was now almost time for the Jewish Passover celebration. This Passover is the last one of Jesus' life. Right here. This moment that we are now seeing begins the last week and a half of Jesus' life. There's still a lot of John left. But this is the last week now of Jesus' life, roughly. Because it's not quite the day of Passover, right? When Jesus dies. But it's getting to be there. Now, as this festival nears, all kinds of people are coming in. Remember, this is one of the required festivals for people to come to Jerusalem. If they are able, they're supposed to come to Jerusalem. So everybody's moving towards Jerusalem, getting there early to start their purification ceremony. Now, it's described in Exodus 19 and Numbers 9. I'll give a short, brief explanation of it. It was a process where they really couldn't do anything for 3 days to cleanse themselves of unholiness, of whatever, cleanse themselves after traveling. 3 days, cleanse yourself. Then you can start Passover. So that's why everybody's flocking to Jerusalem now. And as they get there, they're looking for Jesus. Looking around to see, is he coming to this festival? He's been at every other one, so where's he at? Well, of course, he wasn't there. He's in Ephraim. People are kind of looking around for him because there's a new law. Remember, I said the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin are plotting to kill Jesus now. That backside of this turning point. I had a wonderful picture I would have loved to throw up. It was, if you know Dog the Bounty Hunter. The new law in place was that if you see Jesus, report him to us so we can arrest him. Almost now, everyone's almost a bounty hunter, running the streets of Jerusalem looking for Jesus so they can report him to the Pharisees. That's the aftermath of this peak, beautiful moment of Jesus' ministry. Now in hiding, quote unquote, because Jesus isn't hiding from the public. It's a massive turning point. Everything changed right here. Went from publicly displaying who he is to just spending time with the disciples. It's a massive turning point. We have massive turning points in our life. Each one of us. Whatever it may be, there's massive turning points. But I argue there's one, if not two, that are more important than any other. The most important turning point in our life is that turning point from death to life. The moment we stand there, we kneel, whatever it may be, and we say, Jesus, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one sent from God. What Martha proclaimed. That moment when our life completely changes from eternally dead to eternally alive. Now, I hope and I pray that you've had that turning point in your life. It is a beautiful one. There's no, don't quote me on that. There's a couple hard times about that turning point because Satan really gets to work. But it's a beautiful turning point. Beautiful turning point. Most important one in our life. The second one I argue, if you've already had that turning point from death to life, may I beg that you have a turning point where we lay off those grave cloth, that grave cloth, and live in our freedom. Live in the freedom Christ died for. Because, you know what? We can be eternally alive and still just be bogged down in the mud of our old sinful lives. Lay off that grave cloth and live. Live in freedom. Live in prayer like Christ did. Man, I tell you what, when we lay that old life off and live in the freedom, it is more refreshing than a taste of water on a 150-degree day. I promise you that. I've never lived through a 150-degree day, but I promise you that refreshment that comes from living in freedom is better than anything we could ever imagine. And here's the good news. We may be bogged down. You may be bogged down. I sometimes am bogged down in my old sinful ways. But here's the good news. Christ already won. Christ already won. We know the ending. So live in the freedom we have now. Live in the freedom Christ already won. It's already happened. Well, you know what I mean. We know the outcome. Live like it. And I will raise my hand and be the first to say, I need to live in my freedom sometimes. At times, I live in my freedom, and it's more refreshing than anything. But other times, I forget what the outcome is and get so caught up in today, I don't live in freedom. I let those grave clothes wrap back around me and say, no, you're not free. Because I forget the outcome that Christ already died, already raised from the grave, and already has defeated Satan. Let's live like it. Let's have that turning point where we say, you know what? No, that's the wrong way. I'm turning around and living in freedom. Repentance. It's beautiful. And it's a daily thing we have to do. To actively live in that freedom. To actively have a turning point and walk with Christ. But there's nothing better. Jacob, if you want to go ahead and pull it up. We won't have lyrics, unfortunately. But some people might know this song. We sang it at Connect Conference. If you were there with North Platte Bereans,